Hey folks, thanks for joining our Monday Mindshare. I wanted to follow up on the Mindshare we did 2 weeks ago, which was talking about Zone 2 aerobic, the long, slow distance sessions. And the reason I want to follow up on that is there are really two aspects of improving fat ox and what are the most determinant factors of, very efficient fat oxidation. And this is all in the spirit of being able to burn fat efficiently, that we can reserve glycogen for the latter end of our competitions to finish strong. So as we said, there's some good research done, really wasn't that long ago, a year and a half ago, about these two determinant factors. That last Mindshare we did talked about the Zone 2 workout and how to fuel yourself around that to really impact that well. Today, I want to talk about fat ox just by diet and how do we improve that maximally in our diet and what are the factors that drive this. Now, in our own athletes, we see cases of up to 300% improvement, and this in fat oxidation efficiency. And this happens by consistency in training and diet to drive that improvement. Now, just remember that it's not about what you do once. This is all about consistency, whether it's, training physically, our workouts, etc., or specifically diet. It's about what we do consistently that drives adaptation and change to our physiology. Recent research has demonstrated that even in as little as 4 weeks of a consistent higher fat diet, and we're going to talk more about that particular research soon, but in 4 weeks in athletes, you can enable very high fat oxidation rates. In this case, was measured in some cases over 2 grams per minute, which we haven't seen before, even during high intensity VO2 max workloads. So if you haven't gone and seen what we talked about a few weeks ago on Zone 2 aerobic workouts, you'll see the link below. But let's talk about now the diet side of influencing your fat oxidation rates. And I'm going to talk about research from both animal studies and also athlete studies and see what we can take away from the type of fat and the timing of fat, what's the good fats and what's the not so good fats that can help support this. Well, about 30 years ago, researchers began to show, and this was in animals, that endurance or time to exhaustion could be notably improved by about 10%, depending upon the type of fat consumed. Now, what they trialed was animals that consumed medium chain fats and animals that consumed long chain fats. And what they found was for those that were consuming medium chain fats that, about 20% improvement in key mitochondrial enzymes and also the utilization and oxidation of ketone bodies when compared to the animals that were consuming long-chain fats. There was another study in 2011. Research compared animals also for about a month, a 4-week period on a diet of long-chain fats versus animals on medium-chain fats. And it was shown that certainly in those animals that were just exclusively on long-chain fats, that a number of both exercise performance and enzymes associated with mitochondrial efficiency were impaired. Conversely, there was no negative effect on mitochondrial efficiency or exercise performance in the animals that were consuming medium chain fats. And I'm going to come back to this later because when you look into this particular study, the predominant fat that was consumed by those animals on long-chain fats was a particular fatty acid called palmitic acid, and we'll talk more about that later. Interestingly, more recent studies have shown that MCTs actually can provide also some protection against what happens when our heat dramatically, or not dramatically, but increases, and there's an impairment to our ability to exercise at certain intensity levels. So it impairs effectively our performance, this generation of heat. And the research has highlighted that there is an upregulation of certain protein levels involved in mitochondrial biogenesis And this could explain how these animals actually had some protection against the heat impairment effect of exercise. It was interesting because in a recent podcast, I asked Dan, Dr. Dan Plews, about how much time do you actually need at the higher heat levels where the body's physiology will begin to be impaired in terms of its performance. And I was a little taken back and maybe surprised at his quite immediate response. And he basically said anything beyond a minute. And his point is that, look, as soon as that heat begins to arise, the effect or the impairment effect of heat begins to have a detrimental effect on performance. And obviously he has the whole course, and I'll put the link down below, on how to best manage heat for endurance performance. And one of the factors that we highlight here ourselves is also the function of medium chain triglycerides in support of that. Now, what's most important against those three studies is that these are animal studies, but the consumption of MCT fats was over an extended period, several weeks. So the effect of these fats in the diet isn't a case of acute consumption enabling an acute benefit, but rather it was the consistency of intake in what drove these physiological adaptations. So that's really important to remember. Don't think it's about taking it the week before or even a few weeks coming in. This is about the consistent day in, day out that will drive that adaptation and the physiological response. Now, let's talk about athlete research. Most recently, earlier in 2023, there was a very distinguished research team that conducted a highly controlled crossover study. So meaning they basically took groups of people and they put them on different diets, and then they had a washout period and then got them to do the reverse diet. And they looked at what happens to a number of biomarkers and performance tests, etc., to understand implications. Now, this again was over a 4-week period, and it was of a lower carb, higher fat diet versus a higher carb, low fat diet on both performance and also a number of biomarkers: fat oxidation efficiency, cholesterol, looked at blood glucose regulation, etc. And these were middle-aged performance athletes. So the study showed that for higher carb diet, that there was no performance improvement, which has been suggested for a long time. Even at very high VO2 max intensities, this were like 85% of VO2 max. And there was really no improvement over a lower carb, higher fat diet. But notably, the fat oxidation rates dramatically rose on lower carb, high fat diets. Blood glucose levels were in healthy ranges, and total HDL-LDL levels increased. Now, again, note that the time period here of the study was this 4-week period, and this is actually quite a short period of time, really. Though when you review the diet that was applied to the low carb group, and when the crossover happened, the diet of what they say is lower carb, it was, for all intensive purposes, it was a keto diet. It was on 40 to 50 grams of carbohydrate per day. So now we see two factors here playing out here. There was higher fat consumption, which, as we've just been talking about, does have an impact on improved fat oxidation. And secondly, there was very much low carbohydrate consumption. So, while it's a whole other topic about this particular study, it is worth noting that when you dive into this study, in that same 4-week period of time of the study, when the athletes spent time on that higher carb diet, they triggered clinical signs of what we would typically say pre-diabetes. And that is where the fasting glucose levels are greater than 100 millimole in the blood. And this was measured in this particular study using constant glucose monitoring attached to the body. And this appeared in 30% of athletes just in 4 weeks. Now, All that said, there is some evidence of acute benefits of fats for the athlete to consider, the use of fats in the diet. So far, we've talked about the requirement really for there to be consistency and a period of time to drive physiological adaptation of the use of fats in the diet to heighten fat oxidation. Now I want to touch on a few studies that inference that there is probably also some acute benefits of certain types of fats taken in an acute context. So in 1985, there were some researchers that showed that, if you will, a more acute response, and this was particularly shown in the testing of time trial performances of including medium chain triglycerides in addition to carbohydrates in a beverage during that time trial. And researchers suggested that the oxidation of the MCTs, so that fuel, that substrate, in the beverage would seem to have a directly or indirect, i.e. with respect to lactate, reduced glycogen oxidation, which could explain the improved performance, the ability to finish strong because you've still got glycogen to use in the latter end of the time trial. Now, then there was another study in 92 where researchers demonstrated that they tested multiple formulas of maltodextrin with different ratios or gradients of medium chain triglycerides added to the maltodextrin. So they had one that was maltodextrin only, and they had 3 other beverages that have different amounts of medium chain triglycerides. And what they found was that in every case of the formula that had both the maltodextrin, which is basically a maltodextrin is just a number of glucose added together. Similarly, highly branched cyclic dextrin, which is what we use in our Race Plus product. It is a number of glucose packaged together. There's no fructose in it at all. And what they found is on every one of the drinks that had the added MCT oil, that the gastric emptying time was much faster. And in fact, it increased relative to the amount of MCT. And this is probably explained in the study, suggested that by increasing the osmolality, and that's what MCT fats do, or the water solubility of the formula is improved and the absorption because of the MCT fats is improved, is probably contributing to the more rapid gastric emptying. Now, we talk about this also with respect to using highly branched cyclic dextrin versus fructose and just straight glucose. We know it's much faster in gastric emptying. This is really important to get it out of the gut quick to reduce and mitigate the risk of gut distress. It's obviously important that when you need carbohydrate, you want to get it into the blood supply and into the working muscles as fast as possible, and MCTs do that. Now, finally, there was the third study in 2018 of high-intensity workloads of cross-country skiers. Again, this was, in the 80% space of VO2 max, and blood samples were taken after the workout, the test workout was conducted against these skiers, and they found that there was a lot of evidence of lipolysis, or the breakdown of fats, but specifically it was showing that the actual breakdown of fats that was evident through this high-intensity workload was the medium chain fats getting broken down, released into the blood supply, and that's where they could measure it in the blood, in the circulation. Conversely, there was very little evidence of lipolysis or the breakdown of long-chain fatty acids. And again, there's a lot of reason for this, and you can dig down into the studies. We put the references here at the bottom of this article to check it out. So uniquely, medium chain triglycerides, because they are able to rapidly traverse cell membranes without transporters, and transporters are required for movement of long-chain fatty acids across membranes, and even also carbohydrates, glucose, fructose, they all need transporters to move across membranes. Medium chain triglycerides do not. And this has, we believe, contextual relevance in the use of this fatty acid for endurance exercise in relation to that ability to rapidly move across both digestive membranes and also systemic membranes, particularly those of the mitochondria, both in the liver and also in the muscle, for that particular fatty acid to be used as energy. So these studies are all interesting. So what do you make of all of this, and how do you put it into some basic, simple practices? Okay, so firstly, increasing fat in your diet is the number one thing to look at, and it's not on top of a whole bunch of bad carbohydrate. It is about changing the ratio of your macronutrient intake, so that namely means carbohydrate, in the overall diet. So by reducing the carbohydrate and increasing the amount of fats, you will improve your fat oxidation efficiency. Now, generally speaking, when we talk about having a cold keto phase where you're trying to really trigger that adaptation to happen, it's usually about a 4-week exercise. And this would be somewhere in the vicinity of fats being 70% of your calories and your carbohydrates being around about 50 grams per day. Now, once you go through that phase, you can then move your carbohydrate up and down and your fat, a little movement in your fat consumption relative to your training intensity and load. Now, I would suggest you take a look at the EndureqIQ courses that can go into more practical application of how you do this in a dietetic sense relative to long distance triathlon. And you can check that out on the EndureqIQ.com website. Now, second point would be about using MCT fats or medium chain triglyceride fats in the diet and in fueling. Both animal and human studies would suggest that there is a performance improvement outcome and also an improvement in mitochondrial genesis and mitochondrial efficiency through the use of these particular fats. And again, most of these adaptations in the research is requiring several weeks of consistent intake. And we recommend that to use the most ketogenic form of these MCT oils, and that is the C8 and the C10 forms. And the specific inclusion of these fats you can find across a number of our SFuels products. Starting in the morning, our SFuels Keto 3 product has this. Our SFuels Revival Chocolate Shake Mix has this. Our Transform product, which is used for putting into your smoothies, into your own shakes or salad dressings, cooking sauces, even if you were to make foods like pancakes or what have you. This is a way to get that fat into those. And then lastly, our product, of course, used for fueling training and hydration for training, our SFuels Train product. All of those SFuels product has the base foundation of C8, C10, MCT fats. Now, beyond MCT fats, what are the fats you should be first choosing in choosing healthy fats to build out the amount of total fat that you're consuming in your diet? You should be focusing on two forms, the monounsaturates and the polyunsaturates. And for the monos, the key ones to look at is avocado, olives and olive oil, almonds and peanuts. And then for polyunsaturated fats, thinking about where you're adding some flax seeds in the morning, add it to your cereal in the morning, add it to your pancakes or what have you. Have walnuts available to eat around the house, and then choose rather fatty fish in the diet. And we'll talk more about this in a second. We did an article on superfoods last week. You can see we talk a little bit about which of the fish are the ones to grab for in terms of quality, healthy fats in those fish. And of course, this is the EPA and DHA fats. The fourth and final point would be limiting one specific type of fat in the diet. And this is referred to as, or named palmitic acid. By name, palmitic, it's very high in palm oil, but it's not like palm oil is something we, at least in the Western world, eat a lot of. But it does have a reducing effect on fat oxidation. And there's an importance to this of where this particular fat shows up. But before I talk to that, it's worth noting that this particular fat, actually, the body can and absolutely produces it itself. So our guidance would be let the body decide how much of this particular fat it needs to take versus you over-consuming it. And it is easy to over-consume it because this fat can make up anywhere between 50 and 60% of all the fat in your classic meats, whether that's chicken or pork or what have you, also in dairy and also in butter. So we would advise, limiting the use of those foods that have very high palmitic acid content, and in that way reduce the risk associated with actually having a blunting effect of your fat oxidation efficiency because you're using too much of it. Two very easy ways to kind of avoid this. Rather than butter on any way you use butter, use an avocado oil or avocado itself. And two, really choose an overconsumption or a preference for fish versus a lot of pork, chicken, beef, etc. Okay, finally, in closing on this topic, we haven't said anything about nutrients or compounds that can further stimulate and upregulate fat oxidation. And I have talked about this before. And in fact, we have a whole video on this, and specifically around caffeine and some specific nutrients for enhanced fat oxidation. You can check that out below. We'll put the link here and you can watch that. Hopefully that helps you to apply these best practices in heightening your fat oxidation through everyday diet. This is beyond what we talked about in making sure you execute those Zone 2 aerobic long, slow distance workouts. I hope you have some fun with that. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll catch up soon and go longer. Talk soon. Bye.